In July 2009, Fort Bragg's tight-knit military community was rocked by the tragic death of Major Marc Callahan. What initially appeared to be a fatal accident in a friend's apartment would unravel into a dark tale of forbidden love, betrayal, and the deadliest consequences of giving in to temptation. Major Marc Callahan had everything a soldier could want in 2009, a distinguished career in special forces, respect from his fellow operators, and a reputation for unwavering loyalty. At 32, he was known for his intensity in training and his dedication to the Brotherhood of Arms. Despite his professional success, Marc's personal life told a different story. A failed marriage 2 years prior had left him guarded, throwing himself even deeper into his military career rather than risk another relationship. Just across the street from Marc's apartment lived the Reeves, Staff Sergeant Jimmy Reeves and his wife Sophia. Jimmy was Marc's best friend since Ranger School, the kind of friendship forged through shared hardships and unwavering trust. At 30, Jimmy had a steady confidence about him, the kind that came from knowing exactly where he belonged, both in his unit and in his marriage to Sophia. Sophia Reeves, 28, had the kind of beauty that was more grace than glamour. A former teacher who now worked night shifts at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center, she had grown up in a military family and understood the life she had married into. Her relationship with Jimmy had been a whirlwind romance. They met at a unit barbecue, were engaged 3 months later, and married within the year. Marc had been Jimmy's best man, standing beside them as they exchanged vows just 2 years ago. No one could have predicted how those relationships would explode into tragedy. But as the investigation would later reveal, the seeds of destruction were planted on a seemingly ordinary spring morning, when Jimmy hugged his wife goodbye before boarding a bus for a 15-month deployment to Afghanistan. His last words to his best friend were a request that would haunt them all. "Take care of Sophia for me, brother." The pre-dawn air at Fort Bragg hung heavy with moisture, a typical spring morning in North Carolina where even breathing felt like drawing in warm silk. The parking lot outside the deployment center was a scene repeated countless times before. Soldiers in desert camo hugging loved ones goodbye, duffel bags lined up in neat rows, and the low rumble of idling buses waiting to carry another unit to war. Sophia Reeves stood wrapped in her husband's arms, her face pressed against his chest, trying to memorize everything about this moment. The scratch of his fresh haircut against her forehead, the familiar scent of his soap mixed with starched uniform, the strength in his arms that always made her feel safe. Staff Sergeant Jimmy Reeves held his wife tight, his chin resting on top of her head, eyes closed as he savored these final precious minutes. 15 months will go by before you know it, Jimmy murmured, but they both knew it was a lie meant to comfort. 15 months was an eternity. 15 months meant missing their 3rd wedding anniversary, another Christmas, countless Sunday dinners. Standing a respectful distance away, Major Marcus Callahan watched the couple's goodbye with a complex mix of emotions he preferred not to examine too closely. He'd known Jimmy since Ranger School 5 years ago, had stood beside him at his wedding, considered him closer than a brother. Which made the occasional unbidden thoughts about Sophia all the more troubling. 5 minutes. The first sergeant's voice boomed across the parking lot, sending a ripple of renewed tears and tighter embraces through the crowd. Jimmy pulled back slightly, cupping Sophia's face in his hands. "Hey, look at me." He waited until her tear-filled green eyes met his. "I love you. More than anything. And I'll be home before you know it." Sophia managed a wobbly smile, reaching up to straighten his collar in a futile gesture of normalcy. "I love you too. Please be safe. Always am." Jimmy grinned, that confident smile that had first caught her attention 3 years ago at a unit barbecue. The memory hit her with sudden clarity. The way he'd been manning the grill, sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, laughing at something Marc had said. Asterisk 3 years earlier asterisk. The July heat had been oppressive, but the shade of the massive oak trees in Captain Wilson's backyard provided some relief. Sophia had come with her friend Katie, another teacher who was dating one of the soldiers. She hadn't planned to stay long. These military gatherings always made her feel slightly out of place. But then she'd noticed him at the grill, his easy smile and the way he seemed to draw people to him naturally. That Staff Sergeant Reeves, Katie had supplied, following her gaze. "Jimmy. He just got back from Iraq 2 months ago. And the tall one next to him is Major Callahan, They went through ranger school together. Sophia had been trying not to stare, but something about Jimmy's presence kept drawing her attention. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance. When Katie's boyfriend had finally introduced them, that confidence had shifted into an almost shy charm that was completely disarming. "Would you like a burger?" he'd asked, then immediately grimaced. That's probably the worst opening line in history. She'd laughed, surprising herself. Actually, it's refreshingly direct. I appreciate a man who leads with food. The afternoon had melted into evening as they talked, discovering shared experiences as military kids who'd grown up moving from base to base. Jimmy's father had been Air Force, Sophia's Army. They compared notes on the best and worst assignments, laughed about the universal experience of being the new kid every couple years. Marc had drifted in and out of their conversation throughout the day, his dry wit providing the perfect counterpoint to Jimmy's more outgoing personality. Watching them interact, it was clear they shared the kind of brotherhood that went beyond mere friendship. "Those two have been inseparable since ranger school," Katie explained later. "Marc was already an officer when they met, but you'd never know it from how they are together. They've saved each other's lives more than once." The romance that followed was a whirlwind. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates, long phone conversations, and within 2 months they were discussing marriage. Some might have called it rushed, but to Sophia and Jimmy, it felt like finally finding the missing piece they'd both been searching for. The wedding was small but joyful, held in the historic chapel on base. Marc stood as best man, his toast both touching and hilarious as he recounted their ranger school adventures, carefully edited for mixed company. Sophia remembered watching Jimmy laugh at Marc's stories, seeing the deep bond between them, and feeling grateful her husband had such a loyal friend. 2 minutes. The first sergeant's voice snapped Sophia back to the present moment. Jimmy was already shouldering his duffel bag, his face settling into the focused expression she recognized as his soldier mode. "Marc." Jimmy turned to his friend, extending his hand. The two men clasped hands, then pulled into a brief, fierce hug. "Take care of her for me, brother. You know I will." Marc's voice was steady, betraying none of the complexity churning beneath his professional exterior. "Just focus on your mission and coming home." Jimmy nodded, then turned back to Sophia for one final kiss. She tried to pour everything she couldn't say into that kiss, her love, her fear, her pride, her hope. Then he was walking away, joining the line of soldiers boarding the bus, and Sophia felt her composure starting to crack. A warm hand settled on her shoulder. "Come on," Marc said quietly. "I'll drive you home." Sophia nodded, unable to trust her voice. She stood watching until Jimmy's bus pulled away, until she couldn't see it anymore through her tears. Only then did she let Marc guide her to his truck. The drive home was silent, but not uncomfortably so. Marc had always had a gift for knowing when words weren't needed. It wasn't until they pulled into her driveway that Sophia realized she'd forgotten she'd driven herself to the deployment center. "I'll pick you up tomorrow to get your car," Marc offered. "Unless you want to go back now." Sophia shook her head. The thought of returning to that parking lot, now empty of everything except goodbye tears and lingering cologne, was unbearable. "Tomorrow is fine. Thank you, Marc." He watched until she was safely inside before driving away. Alone in his truck, Marc finally allowed himself to acknowledge the growing unease in his gut. These next 15 months were going to test his loyalty in ways he wasn't sure he was prepared for. The ghost of his own failed marriage whispered warnings about loneliness and temptation. But Jimmy was his brother in every way that mattered. And Sophia was Jimmy's wife. Those were lines Marc had no intention of crossing, no matter how beautiful her smile or how much her quiet strength reminded him of everything he'd lost in his own divorce. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Marc was determined to keep this one firmly shut. If only he'd known then how spectacularly he would fail. 2 months into Jimmy's deployment, the rhythm of life had settled into a new normal that neither Marc nor Sophia had anticipated. It started innocently enough, Marc noticing Sophia's car still parked at the hospital long after her shift should have ended, his protective instincts kicking in as he thought about her driving home exhausted at 3 a.m. "Let me pick you up," he'd offered one afternoon, catching her checking her mail. "It's not safe," You being on the roads that late when you're tired. Sophia had hesitated, but the genuine concern in his eyes wore down her resistance. Jimmy would want you to let me help, he'd added quietly, and that had settled it. And so began their late-night drives. At first, the conversations were safe, work stories, memories of Jimmy, base gossip. But somewhere between the empty streets and the soft glow of dashboard lights, walls began to lower. I keep having this dream, Sophia confessed one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy's trying to call me, but I can't hear him. I keep saying hello, but... She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself. Marc's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He's okay, Sophia. Jimmy's one of the best soldiers I know. I know. I just... She turned to look out the window, but not before Marc caught the gleam of tears. Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing. Like I'm just... waiting. Is that horrible? No, Marc said softly. It's human. The night shifts at the hospital began taking their toll on Sophia's home maintenance routine. Small things at first, a leaky faucet, a stuck window, the kind of repairs Jimmy would have handled without thinking. Marc found himself offering to help, each visit lasting a little longer than necessary. Jimmy mentioned the garbage disposal was acting up, he said one evening, rolling up his sleeves at her kitchen sink. Mind if I take a look? Sophia leaned against the counter, watching his capable hands work. You don't have to keep checking on me. You know, I'm not completely helpless. I know you're not. Marc glanced up, their eyes meeting for a moment too long. But you don't have to be completely self-sufficient either. The disposal was fixed in 20 minutes. They talked for 2 hours. As spring melted into summer, their conversations deepened. Late nights in her kitchen or his truck became confessionals, places where guards dropped and truths emerged. Sarah left because I was married to the army, Marc admitted one night, speaking of his ex-wife for the first time. Said she couldn't compete with a mistress who kept sending me to war. His laugh was hollow. Maybe she was right. Sophia studied his profile in the darkness. Do you regret it? Choosing the army? Sometimes. But then I think about the men I've served with, lives we've saved. He shrugged. What about you? Any regrets? Only when I let myself think too much. Sophia's voice held an edge of vulnerability that made Marc's chest tighten. Sometimes I wonder if I disappeared completely, how long it would take anyone to notice. I'd notice, Marc said, too quickly. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them before they both looked away. The movie nights began as a way to keep Sophia from spending every evening alone. Marc would bring takeout, they'd watch whatever was on AFN, and for a few hours the empty house felt less lonely. But with each passing week, the casual comfort began shifting into something more dangerous. It happened gradually, the space between them on the couch shrinking, hands brushing while reaching for popcorn, lingering glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. One evening, Sophia fell asleep during the movie, her head eventually coming to rest on Marc's shoulder. He sat perfectly still, his heart racing, knowing he should wake her but unable to bring himself to break the moment. The guilt hit him full force when he got home that night. He could still smell her shampoo, still feel the warmth of her against his side. What the fuck are you doing? He demanded of his reflection. But the man in the mirror had no answers. Jimmy's calls became an exercise in torture for both of them. Sophia would paste on a smile and tell him everything was fine, dying inside at each lie of omission. Marc would avoid the house on days he knew Jimmy would call, but somehow knowing she was just across the street, talking to his best friend, made the distance seem even smaller. The worst part is how much I miss him, Sophia confessed one night as Marc drove her home from work. But sometimes I'm not sure if I miss Jimmy, or if I just miss not being alone. The words hung in the air between them, too honest to take back, too raw to acknowledge. Marc's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel as he fought the urge to reach for her. It all came to a head one Saturday afternoon in late July. Marc had come over to help Sophia unload groceries, another task that had somehow become his responsibility. They were in the kitchen, putting things away, when Sophia reached for a box of pasta on a high shelf. Marc moved to help automatically, his chest brushing against her back as he reached up. Time seemed to stop. Neither of them moved, the heat between their bodies building like a thunderstorm about to break. Sophia's breath caught as Marc's free hand settled on her waist, steadying her. Or maybe steadying himself. "Marc," she whispered, and his name on her lips was both a warning and a plea. He stepped back abruptly, putting distance between them. "I should go." "Wait." Sophia turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What are we doing?" "Nothing," Marc said firmly, even as every fiber of his being screamed at him to close the distance between them. "We're not doing anything. Aren't we?" The question followed him home, echoed in his dreams, haunted his waking hours. Because they were doing something. Something that was destroying his loyalty to his best friend piece by piece. Something that made him hate himself even as he craved more. That night, alone in his apartment, Marc pulled out the photo from Jimmy's wedding. The three of them laughing together, happiness frozen in time. He traced the edge of the frame, remembering Jimmy's words at the deployment center. "Take care of her for me, brother." "I'm trying," Marc whispered to the photo. "God help me. I'm trying." But even as he said the words, he knew he was failing. Because taking care of Sophia had become something dangerous, something that went far beyond the brotherly concern Jimmy had intended. Every smile, every laugh, every shared secret was another step down a path that could only end in destruction. And the worst part? Some nights, in the darkest hours before dawn, Marc wasn't sure he cared anymore. August brought the kind of storms that made Fayetteville feel like a tropical jungle. The air electric with possibility and danger. The night everything changed, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the streets into shallow rivers. Sophia's ancient Honda finally gave up the ghost 2 miles from home, sputtering to a stop on a dark stretch of road. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. She stared at the screen for a long moment before making the call she knew she shouldn't make. Marc answered on the first ring. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. The wait felt eternal. Sophia watched raindrops race down her windshield, trying not to think about how Marc's voice had held no surprise, as if he'd been waiting for her call. When his truck's headlights finally cut through the darkness, her heart started racing for reasons that had nothing to do with relief. "Get in," he called through the passenger window. "We'll come back for your car tomorrow." The inside of his truck was warm, intimate. Water dripped from Sophia's hair onto her shoulders, and she was acutely aware of how her wet clothes clung to her skin. Marc's white t-shirt wasn't faring much better, almost transparent where the rain had soaked through. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm sorry for..." "Don't." His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "You never have to apologize to me." They drove in charged silence, the rain drumming on the roof creating a world that felt separate from reality. Marc pulled into her driveway but didn't turn off the engine. Neither moved to leave. "We should go inside," Sophia finally said. "Until the rain lets up." They both knew it was an excuse. Both pretended to believe it. The moment her front door closed behind them, the pretense shattered. Marc stepped toward her just as she turned to face him, their emotions bubbling to the surface. A desperate kiss, raw with unspoken feelings. His hands brushed against her wet hair while her fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him close. "We can't," Marc gasped, his forehead resting briefly against hers, even as the moment pressed them toward each other. "I know," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible, their breaths mingling in the quiet tension of the room. When they finally stepped apart, the weight of reality settled heavily between them. Marc staggered backward, his face clouded with realization. "Oh God," he muttered, his voice filled with anguish. "Jimmy." Sophia slid down the wall, her knees giving way beneath her. "What have we done?" she murmured, her voice trembling. Neither had an answer. Marc fled into the rain, and Sophia sat there until sunrise, touching her lips and trying to remember why this was wrong when it had felt so right. The next week was agony. They avoided each other completely, both throwing themselves into work, trying to stay busy enough to forget. It didn't work. Every time Sophia closed her eyes, she felt Marc's hands in her hair, his breath on her skin. Every time Marc tried to sleep, he heard her soft gasp when their lips first met. It was inevitable that they would break. The first time was in a park on the outskirts of town. A chance encounter that wasn't chance at all. Their eyes met across the walking path, and minutes later they were hidden behind a grove of trees, kissing desperately, hands exploring with frantic need. "This is insane," Marc said. "Completely insane," Sophia agreed. After that, the floodgates opened. They found excuses to meet wherever they could. Quiet corners of restaurants where no one would know them, hidden spots in the park, and finally, inevitably, Marc's apartment. Each time they swore it would be the last. Each time they came back for more. They moved together like they'd been lovers for years, knowing each other's rhythms instinctively, finding pleasure in the midst of pain. Afterward, lying in Marc's bed, reality began to seep back in. Sophia's wedding ring caught the light, and she felt tears start to fall. Marc pulled her close, his own guilt evident in the tension of his body. "We have to stop," he whispered into her hair. "I know," she said, but they both knew they wouldn't. The affair took on a life of its own. They became experts at stolen moments, quick kisses in elevators, lingering touches in passing, coded text messages arranging their next meeting. The threat of discovery added a sharp edge of excitement to their encounters, even as it filled them with dread. Jimmy's calls became exercises in torture. Sophia would lock herself in the bathroom afterward and cry, hating herself for the lies, hating herself more for not regretting them enough to stop. Marc would drink himself to sleep on those nights, Jimmy's trust like acid in his gut. "I love you," Marc confessed one night, the words torn from him as they lay tangled in his sheets. "God help me. I love you." Sophia's tears fell onto his chest. "Don't. Please don't." But it was too late. The words were out there, making real what they'd both been feeling. Their relationship had grown beyond mere physical attraction or lonely comfort. They were in love, a devastating, destructive love that threatened to burn everything in its path. The guilt was constant, but so was the need. They began taking more risks, growing bolder in their desperation to be together. A quick kiss in her kitchen turned into making love on the couch. A discreet dinner led to them holding hands across the table, too lost in each other to notice the stares. "Someone will see us," Sophia would warn, even as she pulled Marc into dark corners for heated embraces. "Let them," he would growl, past caring about consequences in the moment of passion. But they both cared in the aftermath, lying awake in separate beds, thinking about the destruction they were creating. Each of Jimmy's emails was like a knife to the heart. His trust in both of them, his love for them both, made their betrayal all the more bitter. Yet they couldn't stop. The magnetic pull between them was too strong, the emotional connection too deep. They were falling, knowing the landing would shatter them all, but unable to change course. 1 month into their affair, Sophia got an email from Jimmy with a photo attached. Him and his unit, grinning at the camera, desert stretching endlessly behind them. The subject line read, "Missing you both." That night, in Marc's bed, she cried in his arms. "We're going to destroy him." Marc pulled her closer, his own tears falling into her hair. "We're going to destroy us all." He was right. But even knowing that, neither of them could find the strength to end it. They were past the point of no return, tumbling toward a tragedy of their own making, too in love to stop and too guilty to fully embrace their happiness. The storm that had started their affair was nothing compared to the one building on the horizon. The first signs were subtle enough to ignore. Sophia blamed her nausea on stress, her fatigue on long hospital shifts. But when she missed her period for the second month in a row, the truth became impossible to deny. She spent $300 buying pregnancy tests from different pharmacies, not wanting to risk being recognized. Each pink line was like a death sentence to her carefully compartmentalized world. For 3 days, she carried the secret alone, feeling it grow heavier with each passing hour. She went through the motions of her life like a sleepwalker, working her shifts, maintaining her routine, meeting Marc for their usual rendezvous. But inside, she was screaming. The breaking point came during one of their clandestine dinners at a quiet restaurant outside of town. Marc was talking about some training exercise, but Sophia couldn't focus on his words. All she could see was the future crumbling around them. "Sophia." Marc's voice seemed to come from far away. "What's wrong?" The concern in his eyes broke her. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, the words falling between them like bombs. Marc's face went through a rapid succession of emotions. Shock, joy, horror, fear. His hand reached for hers across the table, then stopped midway, remembering they were in public. "Let's go," he said quietly. "We need to talk somewhere private." The drive to his apartment was silent, both lost in the magnitude of what they were facing. As soon as his door closed behind them, Sophia burst into tears. Marc pulled her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed against his chest. "I'm so scared," she choked out. "What are we going to do?" Marc's hands trembled as they stroked her hair. How far along?" "About 8 weeks, I think." She pulled back to look at him, her face tear-stained. "It has to be yours. Jimmy and I, it's been months since." The reality of that hit them both. There would be no possibility of hiding this, no way to pretend the baby could be Jimmy's. The date would make it impossible. "We have to tell him," Marc said finally, his voice hoarse. This changes everything." Sophia jerked away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. "Tell him? Tell him what exactly? That his wife and his best friend have been sleeping together behind his back? That we're having a baby while he's fighting in a war zone? What's the alternative?" Marc ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Wait until he comes home to a baby that's obviously not his? Let him figure it out on his own. He'll never forgive us. He's never going to forgive us anyway." Marc's voice rose with emotion. "But at least if we tell him ourselves." "You'll destroy his whole world," Sophia whispered. "While he's in a combat zone. How is he supposed to focus on staying alive when we drop this bomb on him?" The truth of that silenced them both. They stood there in Marc's living room, the space between them filled with unspoken words and impossible choices. "I love you," Marc finally said, his voice breaking. "I know that makes me the worst kind of bastard, but I love you. And that's my baby you're carrying. God help me. I want us to be a family." Sophia felt fresh tears start to fall. "How can you even think about that? About a future built on this much pain?" "Because I have to." Marc moved to her, taking her face in his hands. "Because every time I close my eyes, I see it, you and me, our child, a life together. I know it's selfish, I know it's wrong, but I want it so badly I can't breathe." Their lips met in a desperate kiss, salt from their tears mingling as they clung to each other. For a moment, Sophia let herself see the future Marc described. A home together, a family, love without guilt. Then Jimmy's face flashed in her mind, and she pulled away. "We can't," she whispered. "We can't do this to him." The next few weeks became an exercise in torture. Every time the phone rang, Sophia's heart would stop, thinking Jimmy had somehow found out. Every time she saw a neighbor watching her too closely, she wondered if they knew her secret. The close call came on a Tuesday afternoon. They had gotten careless, too wrapped up in their own drama to maintain their usual caution. Marc had come over to help Sophia through a bout of morning sickness, holding her hair back as she retched into the toilet. They didn't hear the knock at first, didn't realize anyone was there until Mrs. Peterson from next door called out Sophia's name. They froze, hearing the older woman's footsteps in the hallway. Marc ducked into the shower stall just as Mrs. Peterson appeared in the bathroom doorway. "Oh, honey, are you sick?" The concern in the older woman's voice made Sophia's guilt flare anew. "Just a stomach bug," she managed to say, praying Mrs. Peterson wouldn't notice the man's boots visible under the shower curtain. "I thought I saw Marc's truck outside." Mrs. Peterson's voice held a note of suspicion. He was helping me with some repairs," Sophia said quickly. "Left a little while ago. Must have parked somewhere else." The lie tasted bitter in her mouth, made worse by Mrs. Peterson's obvious skepticism. After what felt like an eternity, the older woman left, but the damage was done. They had come too close to discovery. "We have to be more careful," Marc said later, pacing his living room. "No more meetings at your house." "No more anything," Sophia interrupted. "We have to stop. Completely." But they both knew they couldn't. The pregnancy had created a bond between them that was impossible to break. Every doctor's appointment Sophia couldn't share with Jimmy, every milestone of her pregnancy, drew her and Marc closer together even as it tore them apart. Marc began having dreams, vivid, detailed visions of a life that could never be. He would wake up with memories of teaching a dark-haired child to throw a baseball, of Sunday mornings with Sophia in his bed, of a simple gold ring on her finger that he had put there legally, lovingly. The dreams tormented him, showing him everything he wanted and could never have. He threw himself into work, volunteering for extra duties, anything to exhaust himself enough not to dream. But still they came. Sophia's guilt manifested differently. She began obsessively cleaning her house, as if she could somehow scrub away her sins. She took down photos of her wedding, unable to look at Jimmy's smiling face. When he called, she had to run to the bathroom afterward to throw up, morning sickness mixing with shame. The weight of their secret grew heavier with each passing day. Every kick of the baby was a reminder of their betrayal. Every email from Jimmy was like a knife to the heart. They were drowning in lies, in love, in guilt. "We could leave," Marc suggested one night, his voice hollow. "Just go somewhere else, start over." Jimmy would move on eventually. Maybe that would be kinder than the truth. But they both knew they couldn't. The roots of their lives were too deep here, their connections too intertwined. Running away wouldn't solve anything. The guilt would follow them. The pain would find them. The truth would eventually surface. As Sophia's pregnancy progressed, hiding it became increasingly difficult. She took to wearing loose scrubs at work, claiming weight gain from stress eating. But soon that wouldn't be enough. Soon everyone would know, and their carefully constructed house of cards would come crashing down. "I wish I could hate you," Sophia told Marc one night, her hands resting on her slightly swollen belly. "It would be so much easier if I could just hate you." Marc's hand covered hers over their unborn child. "I know. I wish I could hate me too." But they didn't hate each other. They loved each other with a desperate, devastating love that was destroying everything in its path. The baby growing inside Sophia was both a miracle and a curse, a tangible symbol of their love and their betrayal. The weight of their secret was becoming unbearable. Something had to break. They just didn't know it would break them all. The email arrived without warning on a Wednesday morning. Jimmy's unit was coming home early due to a change in deployment schedules. 3 days. They had 3 days to prepare for a homecoming that shouldn't have happened for another 4 months. "Oh God," Sophia gasped, clutching her phone. She was 11 weeks pregnant now, not showing enough to be obvious, but the morning sickness had gotten worse. She immediately called Marc. "I saw the email," he said before she could speak. His voice was tight with tension. "We need to tell him. As soon as he gets back. Before he figures it out himself." But they both knew they wouldn't. They were cowards in the end, too afraid to face the consequences of their actions. The homecoming ceremony was a special kind of torture. Marc stood with the other officers, watching as buses pulled into the parking lot of the welcome center. Sophia stood with the other wives, her face pale, hands clasped tightly in front of her still flat stomach. Their eyes met once across the crowd, a look of shared panic quickly broken. Jimmy stepped off the bus looking thinner but strong, his face breaking into that familiar wide smile when he spotted Sophia. Marc watched as his best friend swept his wife into a passionate embrace, spinning her around as she forced herself to laugh. The sight made him physically ill. "Brother." Jimmy released Sophia and pulled Marc into a fierce hug. "Kept my girl safe for me." Marc felt Sophia flinch at those words. "Always," he managed to say, the lie bitter on his tongue. The next few days were a nightmare of pretense. Jimmy wanted to spend time with both of them, catching up, sharing stories, rebuilding the easy friendship they'd once had. Each dinner together was an exercise in careful words and avoided glances. Sophia claimed her nausea was a stomach bug. Marc made excuses to leave early, unable to bear watching Jimmy kiss his wife. But Jimmy wasn't stupid. Special Forces operators were trained to notice details, and something was off about both his wife and his best friend. Sophia seemed to shrink away from his touch. Marc couldn't look him in the eye. They were never in the same room together unless Jimmy was there. The note was his first real clue. He found it while helping Sophia do laundry, a small piece of paper that had fallen from her scrub pocket. Just a few words in Marc's distinctive handwriting. I miss you. Always. The paper was worn, as if it had been unfolded and refolded many times. Jimmy said nothing, but he began to watch more carefully. He noticed how Sophia's hand trembled when Marc's name was mentioned. He saw how Marc's jaw clenched whenever Jimmy touched his wife. Small things, tiny tells, but they began to form a pattern he didn't want to see. The breaking point came 3 weeks after his return. Sophia had been acting strange all day, distracted and nervous. She claimed she had to work a night shift, but when Jimmy called the hospital on a hunch, they said she'd switched to days weeks ago. He followed her car that evening, his heart pounding as she drove not toward the hospital but to a familiar apartment complex. He watched her park next to Marc's truck. Watched her use a key to let herself in. Jimmy sat in his car for an hour, memories flooding his mind. Marc standing as his best man. Sophia's laughing face at their wedding. The trust between brothers in arms. All lies. When he finally got out of the car, his movements were mechanical. Each step up the stairs felt like walking through deep water. He could hear their voices through the door, soft, intimate murmurs that stabbed him through the heart. The door wasn't locked. He opened it silently, a lifetime of tactical training serving him now in the worst possible way. They were on the couch, Sophia curled into Marc's side as he stroked her hair. The domesticity of the scene was what broke him. This wasn't just sex, this was intimacy. This was love. How long? His voice shattered the quiet like a gunshot. They jerked apart, faces draining of color. Sophia let out a small cry of shock. Marc stood slowly, putting himself between Jimmy and Sophia in an instinctive protective gesture that only enraged Jimmy further. Jimmy, Marc started, hands raised. Let us explain. How long? Each word was bitten off, deadly quiet. Since you deployed, Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jimmy laughed, a horrible broken sound. The whole time? The whole fucking time I was over there, trusting you both. Brother, please, Marc took a step forward. Don't you dare call me that. Jimmy's control snapped. He launched himself at Marc, years of combat training behind the punch that connected with his former friend's jaw. Marc didn't fight back at first, accepting the punishment he felt he deserved. But when Jimmy's next punch split his lip, survival instincts kicked in. He blocked the third strike, countered with a push that sent Jimmy staggering back. Stop it! Sophia screamed, but neither man heard her. They grappled like animals, crashing into furniture, all technique forgotten in pure rage and pain. Blood sprayed as Jimmy's elbow caught Marc's nose. Marc's counterstrike sent them both sprawling into the coffee table, shattering glass. I trusted you. Jimmy roared, punctuating each word with a blow. You were my brother. I love her. Marc shouted back, finally giving voice to the truth that had destroyed them all. The words seemed to freeze Jimmy for a moment. In that pause, Sophia's voice cut through. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was deafening. Jimmy turned slowly to stare at his wife, understanding dawning in his eyes. His next words were eerily calm. Is it his? Sophia's sob was answer enough. Jimmy let go of Marc's shirt, stepping back as if burned. He looked between them, his best friend's bloody face, his wife's tear-streaked cheeks, the evidence of their betrayal written in their guilty eyes. Jimmy, Sophia reached for him. Please. But Jimmy was already moving, heading for the door with the unstoppable momentum of a man whose world had just ended. Marc struggled to his feet, spitting blood. Let me explain. Jimmy's fist caught him completely by surprise. The force of it sent Marc stumbling backward, his head connecting with the corner of the granite countertop with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor and didn't move. Blood began pooling around his head, dark against the light tile. Marc! Sophia's voice was strange, distant. Marc! Jimmy stood frozen, watching red spread across his best friend's kitchen floor, understanding with horrible clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. Time seemed to fragment in the moments after Marc hit the counter. Sophia would later remember it in flashes, the hollow sound of skull meeting granite, the way Marc's body folded so unnaturally, the horrible silence before the blood began to pool. Jimmy stood motionless, his face a mask of horror as he stared at his fallen friend. His hands, the hands that had thrown that final, fatal punch, trembled at his sides. "Marc!" Sophia's scream broke the frozen moment. She rushed to him, her medical training kicking in as she checked his pulse. It was there, but weak and thready. "Call 911. Jimmy, call them now." Jimmy fumbled for his phone, his voice cracking as he gave the dispatcher Marc's address. Sophia pressed her hands against the wound at the back of Marc's head, watching helplessly as blood seeped between her fingers. "Stay with me," she pleaded, tears falling onto Marc's still face. "Please, please stay with me." The minutes until the ambulance arrived felt like hours. Marc's breathing grew more labored, a terrible gurgling sound that Sophia knew meant nothing good. Jimmy paced behind her, muttering what might have been prayers or curses. The paramedics burst in with controlled urgency, gently but firmly moving Sophia aside. She watched them work, their clinical terms cutting through her fog of panic. Severe head trauma, unconscious, pupils unresponsive. In the chaos, the first cramp hit her. Sharp, low in her belly, but she ignored it. Only when she stood to follow the stretcher did she notice the blood running down her legs. One of the paramedics caught her as her knees buckled. "We need another bus here." The hospital was a blur of harsh lights and concerned faces. Different doctors, different rooms. Marc rushed to emergency surgery, Sophia to the OB ward. Through it all, she could hear Jimmy's voice answering questions from police, his words drifting through the thin curtain. "Just snapped. Didn't mean to. Oh God, what have I done?" The baby was already gone by the time they got her to the hospital. "The stress," the doctor explained gently. "Sometimes in cases of severe emotional trauma." But Sophia wasn't listening. She was thinking of the life that had grown inside her, the physical manifestation of her love for Marc, now lost like everything else. Word spread through the base community like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew the affair, the pregnancy, the fight. The story grew with each retelling, becoming more salacious, more tragic. Mrs. Peterson from next door gave an interview to the local news, describing how she'd always suspected something wasn't right. Others came forward with their own observations, rewriting history to claim they'd seen it coming. The hospital waiting room became a battleground of divided loyalties. Jimmy's fellow operators stood guard, protecting their brother even as they struggled with their own shock and disappointment. Marc's family arrived from Ohio, their grief tinged with confusion and anger. Sophia sat alone in her hospital room, a pariah. The few wives who had been her friends now walked past her door without looking in. Her phone filled with messages, some sympathetic, most condemning, all adding to the weight of her guilt. The only person who visited was Jimmy's mother, Catherine. She stood in the doorway, looking at her daughter-in-law with eyes full of pain. "I loved you like my own daughter," she said quietly. "We all did." Sophia couldn't meet her gaze. "I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this." Catherine's voice cracked. "Sorry doesn't save Marc, or your baby, or my son's soul." The news from Marc's surgery wasn't good. Words like severe brain trauma and medically induced coma echoed through sterile corridors. The doctors were careful not to make promises. Jimmy was arrested, of course. The base MPs handled it quietly, respectfully. He was still one of their own, despite everything. He went with them without resistance, his eyes vacant, his decorated career ending in handcuffs. Sophia checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice the next day. She couldn't bear the pitying looks from nurses who had once been friendly, the whispers that followed her down the halls. Coming home was worse. Someone had spray-painted "whore" across her garage door. Her front porch was littered with printed copies of Jimmy's deployment photos, torn to pieces. Inside, the house was exactly as she'd left it just days ago, when her biggest worry had been morning sickness. Jimmy's coffee mug still sat on the counter. Their wedding photo still hung in the hallway. The normality of it all broke something inside her. She sank to the kitchen floor and finally let herself break down completely, great racking sobs that felt like they might tear her apart. She cried for Marc, fighting for his life because she hadn't been strong enough to resist loving him. She cried for Jimmy, whose trust she had betrayed so completely. She cried for their baby, who would never know either joy or pain. But mostly, she cried for the people they had all been before: Jimmy's easy smile, Marc's quiet strength, her own certainty in right and wrong. None of them would ever be those people again. The days that followed were a slow torture. Every phone call brought news of another friend cutting ties. The base commander's wife personally came to ask Sophia to resign from the family readiness group. Her supervisor at the hospital suggested she take some time off to deal with her personal issues. She spent hours at Marc's bedside, forbidden during normal visiting hours when his family was there, sneaking in during the night shift when the nurses turned a blind eye. She held his hand and told him about losing the baby, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Jimmy's father, a retired colonel, released a statement to the base newspaper. It was carefully worded, expressing support for his son while acknowledging the tragedy of the situation. The subtext was clear: this was Sophia's fault, her moral failing that had destroyed 3 lives. The weight of it all was crushing. Sophia barely ate, barely slept. She jumped at every sound, expecting more vandalism, more confrontations. The baby's loss left a physical ache that matched her emotional pain. Marc's mother caught her one night in his hospital room. The older woman stood in the doorway, her face lined with exhaustion and grief. "You did this," she said simply. "You and your selfishness. I hope you're happy with what your love has cost us all." Sophia had no defense to offer. The truth was, she wasn't sure which was worse: the people who hated her, or the fact that she hated herself more than any of them could. The Cumberland County Courthouse stood imposing against the autumn sky as Sophia climbed the steps, flanked by lawyers. 2 months had passed since that fatal night. Marc had never regained consciousness, his body finally giving up its fight 3 weeks after the incident. Now Jimmy faced manslaughter charges, and she was about to lay bare their secrets in front of the entire community. The courtroom was packed. Base wives sat in rigid clusters, some supporting Jimmy, others there purely for gossip. Marc's family occupied the front row, his mother's face aged decades by grief, clutching a folded American flag, the only remaining token of her son's distinguished service. Behind them sat Jimmy's parents, the retired colonel's military bearing unchanged despite his son being the defendant. Sophia's hands shook as she took the oath. The prosecutor's questions were gentle but probing, designed to paint Jimmy as a man who had snapped with violent intent. The defense attorney was less kind, picking apart her every decision, every lie. "Did you ever consider," the defense attorney asked, his voice dripping contempt, "what effect your infidelity might have on a man serving his country in a war zone?" "Objection, argumentative," the prosecutor called. "Sustained," the judge replied, but the damage was done. Sophia saw several jurors nodding slightly. "Were you aware," the attorney continued, "that Staff Sergeant Reeves had been diagnosed with PTSD from his previous deployments?" "No," Sophia whispered. "He never told me." "So you didn't consider his mental state when you chose to betray him with his best friend?" A betrayal that ultimately led to Major Callahan's death. Another objection. Another sustaining. But Sophia was already crying, the word death hitting her like a physical blow. The medical examiner testified next, detailing Marc's injuries in clinical terms that couldn't capture the horror of watching him slip away in that hospital bed. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma resulting in severe cerebral hemorrhage, but everyone knew the true cause was love turned to poison. Jimmy took the stand on the 3rd day. Gone was the confident soldier, replaced by a hollow-eyed man in a civilian suit that hung loose on his frame. He spoke in a monotone, describing finding the note, following Sophia, the rage that had overtaken him. "I didn't mean to kill him," Jimmy said, his voice breaking. "He was my brother. I loved him. Every day I wake up hoping this is just a nightmare, but it's not. I killed my best friend." The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case, guilty of manslaughter, but with a recommendation for leniency. The judge, citing Jimmy's service record and clear remorse, sentenced him to 15 years with possibility of parole after 8. As the bailiff led Jimmy away, he caught Sophia's eye one last time. In that look was every moment they'd shared, every promise broken, every dream destroyed. 3 years later, the cemetery at Fort Bragg was peaceful in the morning light. Marc's headstone stood among rows of heroes, his death date a stark reminder of how love could destroy as thoroughly as any enemy bullet. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, from his mother, from fellow soldiers, even anonymous bouquets that the groundskeeper suspected were from Sophia. In a medium-security prison in North Carolina, Jimmy taught other inmates about military history, finding purpose in sharing his experience while serving his time. His hair had gone prematurely gray, but his posture remained military straight. He wrote letters sometimes, to Marc's family, to his own parents, even one to Sophia that he never mailed. Each letter began with an apology to Marc's ghost. Sophia had moved to Seattle, where no one knew her story. She worked nights in a different hospital, avoiding close friendships, keeping her walls high. The small scar on her belly from the miscarriage was her only physical reminder of the child she'd lost, but she carried Marc's death like a weight around her neck. The scandal had left lasting marks on the Fort Bragg community. Policies about fraternization were enforced more strictly. Support groups were established for deployed soldiers' spouses. People spoke in whispers about the Callahan tragedy as a cautionary tale. Jimmy's father had retired fully from military consulting, unable to bear the pitying looks from former colleagues. Marc's mother had retreated from the world, her son's death breaking something in her that would never heal. Both families had been forever altered by one summer of passion and lies. On a rainy Seattle evening, Sophia sat in her small apartment, looking through old photos she usually kept hidden. Jimmy's smile, Marc's kind eyes, their 3 faces together at countless unit functions, happiness captured in frozen moments before everything shattered. Her phone held one saved voicemail from Marc, recorded the morning before his death. She played it sometimes, torturing herself with his voice. I love you. No matter what happens. Remember that. In his prison cell, Jimmy read the obituary he'd kept folded in his Bible. Major Marcus Callahan, decorated Special Forces officer, beloved son, loyal friend. The last part felt like mockery now. Their loyalty to each other had died long before Marc had. He had started writing his memoirs, trying to understand how love and loyalty had become so twisted. Some nights he dreamed of that final moment. Marc falling, the sound of skull meeting granite, Sophia's scream. Other nights he dreamed of simpler times, when brotherhood meant something pure and true. The retired colonel and his wife had moved to Florida, unable to bear the memories in Fayetteville. They sent Jimmy care packages monthly but never visited. Some wounds were still too fresh, even years later. Marc's father had died the previous year, his wife said of a broken heart. The funeral was small, family only. Sophia had sent flowers but didn't attend. Some divides couldn't be crossed, even in death. In her Seattle apartment, Sophia kept a journal, writing letters to both the child and the man she had lost. Your father was a good man, she wrote. He died because I loved him too much and not wisely enough. The base had changed too. New soldiers lived in their old houses. New families created memories where tragedy had once lived. But old-timers still pointed out Marc's former apartment, whispering the story to newcomers as a warning about the price of betrayal. Time moved forward, as it always does. Wounds scarred over, grief dulled to a permanent ache, life continued in its altered form. But in quiet moments, they all remembered the cost of passion, the price of betrayal, the finality of death. Jimmy would be eligible for parole in 5 more years. He didn't know if he would take it. Freedom meant facing a world where he'd killed his best friend, where his actions had destroyed multiple lives. Some days, the structured routine of prison felt safer than the chaos of emotions outside. Sophia dated occasionally, but never seriously. She wore no rings, kept no photos displayed, held herself separate from any chance of deep connection. The capacity for love was still there, but the willingness to risk pain had died with Marc. They had all learned the hardest lesson, that love, unchecked by wisdom or loyalty, could destroy as thoroughly as hate. That passion without honor was a flame that burned everything it touched. That some choices, once made, could never be unmade. In the end, they were all serving life sentences of different kinds. Jimmy in his prison, Marc in his grave, Sophia in her self-imposed exile. 3 lives, 3 sentences, 3 versions of punishment for crimes of the heart. The rain fell in Seattle as Sophia closed her photo album, tucking away the memories of who they had all been before love tore them apart. At Fort Bragg, the evening sun cast long shadows across Marc's headstone. In his cell, Jimmy added another page to his memoirs, trying to understand how brotherhood had turned to betrayal. And somewhere between them all, the ghosts of what might have been lingered, reminding them of what had been lost in the name of love.